I was born in Stoke, near Stoke Station, the heart of the potteries. Most of the clothes I got were from jumble sales, and that was normal. I wanted to see the world. I'd worked out that if I joined the Merchant Navy, they'd pay me to see the world. I joined Canadian Pacific. The order was given to abandon ship. The first lifeboat we lowered got crushed against the superstructure, threw over the first life raft. That burst. So we, at that point, had nothing to get into.
Well, hello and welcome to another edition of My Story. Today we have George Hurlstone with us from Congleton, and lovely to have you here, George.
Thank you for inviting me.
And people keep telling me George has an amazing testimony. So let's see if we can get to the bottom of this. Start with your childhood. How did you grow up?
Well, I think that was one of the first blessings of my life, being born into a lovely family with my mum and dad. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, my dad was born on the 4th of April 26. My mother was born on the 4th of April 28.
Oh.
And my father died on April the 4th, 2006.
How
So we only ever had one birthday. So we were a very close family, very working class. I was born in Stoke, near Stoke Station, the heart of the potteries. Mm-hmm. And yes, I had a lovely childhood. We moved from Stoke to a prefab.
Living in a prefab, what was that like? I have friends who lived in prefabs, but what was it like to live in one?
Brilliant.
Because?
It had an inside toilet, which was brilliant. And it was warm and cosy. Yeah. When the wind blew, it rattled and moved. And the whole estate was very much camaraderie around the estate, all the same situation. Mm. Clearly, later on in life, it was more difficult because they were made of asbestos. And when they knocked them down, they just used sledgehammers to knock them down. But life in the prefab itself was very nice. And not far from the prefabs where we lived, there was an army dump, which had a lot of paraphernalia from the war. Being little, we could get under the fence and get steel helmets and all the other sorts of things. Yeah. So most of the kids had a really good time with real helmets and real webbing and so on and so forth. Mm. Yes, it was really nice. I do remember it very, very fondly. But certainly the concept of having a warm house with some sort of heating rather than one coal fire was amazing.
So with all that industry in Stoke-on-Trent, what was it like growing up there?
Quite dirty, quite smoky. It was quite a working class environment we grew up in. Most of the clothes I got were from jumble sales, and that was normal. As I said, we lived in a prefab, and that was normal at that time. The school itself I went to had air raid shelters. Yes. All the sports equipment. Go and fetch it from the air raid shelter. The toilet block, interestingly, I was talking to my granddaughter about it today. As we were driving through the snow, it reminded me that the toilet block at the school was outside, out in the playground. And if you wanted to go to the toilet, you had to go through the snow to a cold toilet, and that was it. That was how it was. But that's how it was.
Yes, good.
On the flip side of that, it was growing up in the 1960s, which was a great time to be a teenager.
Absolutely.
Yes, and saw the Beatles and all those sort of things. Brilliant age to be in. Later on in the teens, yes. Mm. But early on, it was quite dire. And we lived there till I was 11, and then we moved up to Trent Vale in Stoke-on-Trent. And I went to school there for the high school, and it was quite militaristic, quite strict.
Why was that?
Because a lot of the teachers, the male teachers, had all been in the Second World War in the services.
Ah, yes.
So they brought that with them, that discipline with them. So one, it was quite regimented, and two, it was quite brutal. And I think the whole objective of the school, I know the whole objective of the school, was to produce factory fodder. Because in the potteries, there were so many different types of factories.
Yes.
We had Michelin, we had the steelworks, we had the railways, we had the mines, and of course we had all the plethora of potteries, Wedgwoods and Spode and all the Dalton and all the rest. And so when I'd done my GCSEs, got my 5 GCSEs, that was it. You went to work, and that I did. And I went off into very short time into the pottery industry, very short time. And my dad, who worked at the Michelin, said, I can get you an apprenticeship at the Michelin if you work hard.
Ooh.
And that was a panacea. But I didn't want it.
What did you want to do then, George?
Well, I wanted to see the world, actually.
Uh-huh.
And I'd worked out that if I joined the Merchant Navy, they'd pay me to see the world. So
What a clever idea.
Yeah. So I tootled off to the Liver building in Liverpool, and eventually, after taking tests and things, I joined Canadian Pacific as one of the cadet officers to train up as a deck officer, which would then lead to a captain and beyond. My father was not impressed at all. He thought this was a really bad idea.
Why was that?
He thought that the Michelin apprenticeship was something you just couldn't leave behind. That was it. It was a job for life. The Michelin job for life.
Mm.
But then I got my instructions straight away to join quite a small ship, really, about 3,000 tons, which went round Europe picking up cargo across the Atlantic, and then up the Canadian Seaway. They had to be about that size to get up the locks in the Canadian Seaway, and then up the Great Lakes and back down again, and doing those trips and stopping off at all the different places up and down the Great Lakes, which was a great time, really, for a young lad. But then I needed to get sea time, which was necessary to be at sea rather than in port for your different tickets, different promotions.
Yes.
So I needed to go on a long one. So I switched over to one of the Canadian Pacific ships that sailed out of British Columbia, Vancouver Island.
Right, yes.
And it ran from Chemainus in Vancouver down to Japan. And
That's a long trip, isn't it?
Yes, and it took timber, loads of timber, because there's no timber in Japan. Don't have timber in Japan. And zinc concentrate, which was in the holes, a bit like a big powder. And this is a very big ship. It's a big bulk carrier. Before the days of container ships, by the way.
Of course,
It's a big ship with a big aft accommodation, a big midships accommodation. We started to sail across the Pacific, and it was pretty bad weather. We were forced to go around to Alaska and stay with the bow into the waves, as you always do. And as we got towards mid-Pacific, we started to hit some really bad storms, and hurricane-force storms.
Wow.
And as we were we were about 600 miles from Japan when the storm was so bad that we lost all the deck cargo. And this deck cargo they were huge pieces of wood, massive things, with chains so thick.
Yes. Did it break the chains then, or what?
Like cotton. The whole lot went. And so they sent out the XXX messages over the radio to say there's dangerous stuff in the water. I went off to my cabin to bed, And then in the early hours, the alarms went, and I swung my legs out of my bunk and jumped down and went up to my waist in water. And I thought, well, there must be something going on here. It's wrong.
Yes.
And the alarms, as they were going off, it takes you to your station. So I went straight to the station I was allotted, which was rehearsed, obviously, which was on the bridge with the captain, the first mate, and so on. And I had a life jacket on, and he told me to stuff my life jacket with flares, which I did. And the waves were bashing over us, like we were getting battered, basically. An average wave weighs about 2,000 tons. So these were big hammers hitting the ship, knocking it about. And I remember vividly, I was 40 feet. That's the height of the bridge from the sea. 2 houses worth, one on top of the other. And I looked out, and as far as you could see across the horizon was a huge wave. And that was another 50 feet on us. And on the Lloyd's Register, afterwards, it was recorded as a 90-foot wave that did the damage. And that crashed over. And it broke into all the holes. All the steel hull covers were smashed. And it got into the zinc concentrate and everything else. And that made the ship wobble. And we were struggling at that point inside. She listed over to starboard, which meant that we couldn't get oil to the engines, so we lost power.
Wow,
and
yes,
then
of course.
we were just at the mercy of the storm then. And then the order was given to abandon ship. And we had 2 of these, you've seen these white capsules that have life rafts in them?
Yes.
And they're attached to a cord, and when you throw them, they inflate automatically. There was 2 of those in the after section where I was. And then there were 2 lifeboats, wooden lifeboats,
Right.
down in the stern section of accommodation. So we went ahead and tried to lower those. The first lifeboat we lowered got crushed against the superstructure, so that was 1 lifeboat gone.
Yes.
We lowered threw over the first life raft, that burst. So we, at that point, had nothing to get into. And we had 1 life boat and 1 life raft left. And at this point, I think my Christian values that my mother and father had brought to me, they weren't Christians, but they certainly had Christian values, came to me. And I remember vividly learning the Psalm 23 at school, as you did of a morning when you had to say prayers, and obviously the Lord's Prayer, which we did every day at school. And I prayed most earnestly. I prayed really hard that we would be able to get off the ship. And then we had the second attempt at the life raft, and that got off. And we got the lifeboat, and second life raft went off as well. So we managed to get them off and jump into them. And we put the injured, mainly engineers, because as the ship listed, a lot of the engineers that were in the engine room fell into the superstructure on the engine. And they were hurt, so broken pelvises and legs and arms and things. So we got those flat into the lifeboat, and the rest of us were trying in the life raft. But we had to get away very quickly from the ship because she was going down and we'd be sucked down by the vortex.
Oh yes, I suppose you would.
Yes, you need to go away quickly. And that was quite difficult because we're in heavy water, heavy storm, trying to get away. And again, I was just praying earnestly all the time.
That must have been terrifying. How old were you when all this happened?
19, yes, 19.
Yes.
But there was so much going on, so many things to do, and being told to do things that you got caught up in it, really.
Yes.
And we managed to get away. And as the stern of the ship came up, a huge ship, and went down, you could feel the suction of the vortex, but we weren't pulled into it. And then a lot of the stuff that was on board ship started to shoot out of the water like rockets as the ship went down. But then we had to take turns hanging off the life rafts and the lifeboats because obviously there wasn't enough room for everyone, and on the lifeboats we had the injured. But fortunately the radio office had managed to get off the distress signals, and sometime later, time eludes me at this point, I heard this sound and I thought, oh no, the life raft's punctured, we're doomed, as it were. But it wasn't, it was an aeroplane.
Right.
And it was an aeroplane.
Where was that coming from?
It came from the Tachikawa Air Base in Vietnam, because Vietnam was on at the time.
Yes.
And that's what the Americans were using as a base for their B-52 bombers that bombed Vietnam.
Right.
And they sent out a rescue plane, and I could see it, I could hear it circling. I couldn't see it because of the weather. We were in and out of waves, obviously. And they came over and they dropped, first of all, a mobile surgery by parachute, which came down. It's probably as big as this table. And then it circled and circled again. And I know that the paramedics that they dropped weren't allowed to jump because it was too low and too dangerous, but they did. And they jumped with full frogman outfit in flippers and oxygen tanks and the rest. And they made their way to the lifeboat, and they attended to the injured with this mobile surgery. And eventually, they got a Japanese motor torpedo boat out to us. And it was quite perilous getting from the water in this storm to the ship, but we did in the end. And that took us to Yokohama, at which point the 2 paramedics were picked up by the military and whipped off back to their next mission.
Yes.
But we got home.
How amazing they were able to get down in all that storm.
They did.
Because presumably it's still raging around you.
Yes, it was, yes. And it was very difficult. And they were very, very brave men. Very brave men. And they made a big difference to some of the lads that were injured. Yes. So I came home from there.
Did it put you off? Going to see again?
Not so much me, but for my mother and father, they were adamant that I shouldn't do this again.
Would have been safer at Michelin.
Yeah, safer at the Michelin. I told you so, you'd be safer at the Michelin. But my next trip was on one of these very small ships up the Canadian Seaway across the Atlantic in midwinter,
Yes.
which is a perilous journey anyway. Yeah. So I thought, no, I'll stay at home with Mum and Dad. And eventually ended up at ICL as a computer programmer.
Oh, right, okay.
That's where I was.
Yes.
At that time, some of the old machines were valve machines. And there is a tale at ICL where one of the guys used to be in the Salvation Army and practice his trumpet in the mainframe.
Oh, really?
In the memory, standing inside the memory banks.
Yes, computers were huge in those days.
Oh, yes. And because we programmed in machine code, so you talked to the computer in the language it understood. You didn't have this high-level language. You could operate the machine as well, obviously. And the machine we had was, the one I worked on, was like Starship Enterprise. It was huge. There were buttons everywhere. And
did it take you long to learn it?
Not necessarily. It was a pleasure. I would have done it and not got paid. It was interesting. It was exciting, and it was a great episode in my life. And we'd say to the operators of the machine, "You're going to have a cigarette and all that, and I'll have the machine." So I'd have this huge machine all to myself, and it probably had as much processing power as a Fitbit watch or something like that these days. Yeah. And there I met my first wife in 1970, and we married in 72. And it was really good.
Excellent. Yes.
My wife was a Methodist, and her family were Methodist. So quite early on, I was brought into the church more so than I had been previously through my first wife and her family. And we went to church regularly and were involved in the Methodist church community, which was great. It was really good. We were having quite a splendid life, really. And part of the move to Congleton, my house was at the back of this community centre.
Right.
Which I now know is New Life Church. And one day, this chappie leaned over the fence and he said, "Would you like to come to a beer night?" And I thought, "Beer night? Yes, of course I'll go to a beer night. That's great." So I went to the church, and it was a beer night with the padre from the parachute regiment. And he gave his story.
Yes.
And that was amazing. And at the end of the evening, we were invited to go on to an alpha course. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Changed my life.
Did it answer your questions?
It answered a lot of the questions, actually. But also, in a way, took these pieces of a jigsaw of my life so far and it brought them together. And it was almost pieces starting to fit together, and I began to understand.
So you met Linda at New Life Church?
Yes, I did, yes. And I think that was a bit of matchmaking going on by...
Was there?
The matchmaker of the church, Christine. I think every church has one, doesn't it? But it was very, very fortunate. And Linda and I get on extremely well. And we married in 2007. But Linda came from a divorce and came with a daughter and a son, which I took on board.
Lovely.
With a bit of intrepidation at the start because I was going back to another teenage child and I'd been through that bit. But as it turned out, both the children have been absolutely marvellous. They're married and we have grandchildren through them.
Oh, lovely.
And
yes.
We all get on extremely well. And so the whole family is really a tremendous unit. We all support each other. My son and I now have the same relationship as I did with my dad. And it's a lovely relationship. I see him every week. We go out together every week. And
oh, that's great.
My wife's family, I should say, are down in Surrey. So we go up and down to Surrey and meet Linda's siblings. She's 5 sisters and 1 brother. And he never got married. I wonder why. And I was very fortunate because she was a very strong Christian. Her family were very strong Christians, more from the evangelical church rather than the Methodist. And so again, I've been imbued in a Christian lifestyle through Linda, and we've had a lovely time together. And she's been a great help with the boys and the grandchildren.
Lovely.
And with my first wife. And, we all now get on very, very well.
Amazing. So how did you actually come to acknowledge Jesus?
It was through the Alpha course, and it was giving my life to Jesus and being born again. And that was well over 20 years ago. And I've been with New Life Church for over 20 years. And both Linda and I are trustees of the church. And it's interesting that most of our friends and acquaintances are church people, if you like. A lot of them from New Life Church, but also from other churches. Linda's family are from other churches.
Yes.
And we share the same values. So it's a great thing. It is a really, really good thing.
Yes.
And I have to say, I went back to Chemainus, I went back to Vancouver fishing.
Did you?
Yes, I was on Vancouver Island fishing. And I was going through the woods to this river, the Fraser River, and there was a metal corrugated shack. And it was a little church. And it got a big banner on it saying Alpha, right in the middle of Canada. And it was amazing, yes. So it is worldwide, and it's
it is.
I would recommend anyone to go on the Alpha course. It's change your life for the best.
Yes. Now, looking back over your life, what's the difference that you can see in your life before you came to know Jesus, before you committed your life to him, and afterwards?
I think one of the main things is that before Jesus, I did try to do everything on my own. As being the head of the house, the man of the house, I was responsible for doing everything, and I had all that weight and burden on my shoulders. Since I've become a Christian, I know that Jesus is in my life, and in our lives, our families, all our families' life, and we have him. We have him to help us in everything we do, to guide us in the right direction. He gives us the right direction. We pray daily, and he will direct us and help us. And that's the difference from being on your own to being in a relationship with someone that's there, that loves you and is keen to help you.
Yes. So did you ever hear how the other members of the crew got on after that terrible storm?
Yes, some of them. It's quite interesting, really. We had a 50-year reunion of those that were left. And that was in Liverpool, and it was in the room where the Titanic was designed.
Oh, wow.
And the safe is in the room where all the Titanic plans were. So it was an appropriate place to meet. And there was chief engineer and who'd been in the engine room at the time. And one of the other officers was on the bridge with me at the time. And actually, as I was loading flares in, I put his binoculars into my vest, and I was able to give him his binoculars back.
Oh, after 50 years?
Yes, so he's got his binoculars back. So he was very, very pleased, very pleased.
I'm sure.
Yes, and we discussed it, and this point at which we couldn't get off the ship at all, and we were doomed, and then were able to get off, and it seemed to be more calm, the sea calmed while we got off. And they knew about it, and we talked about it. Now, I'd prayed about it, obviously, and I thought it was an answer to my prayer, but they recognised it and did talk about it.
So you told them it was...
Yes, I did actually, yes. Yes, I did indeed. For which they were grateful, yes, they were grateful. And we do keep in touch now still.
That's lovely.
Those that are left.
Yes.
A lot of the crew have now gone, and a lot of the crew were Chinese.
Oh, were they?
All the deck were Chinese.
So how many crew were there at the time?
About 28.
Wow, that's a lot to get into.
Yes. And
so few boats.
Well, yes, and the lifeboats were only made for 12, so as we lost them, then we were getting fewer and fewer. But the other interesting thing was that the Chinese crew were down in the aft quarters. When it was said to be abandoned, they put on their best clothes and sat down and waited to die.
Did they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so they had to be manhandled by some of the other officers to get off, get on the lifeboats and get overboard. Yes, but they were quite happy to stay there.
Yes,
that was their faith, not our faith.
Very
but
interesting.
Their faith,
yes. So, do you think anybody else came through with a faith in the Lord Jesus?
I don't know is
No.
the honest answer to the question. I'd like to think that was the case, but it certainly made some of them think about it.
Yeah.
And of course it changed my life,
Of course.
coming to faith. It was one of the pieces that brought me to faith. It wasn't the piece, it was one piece.
One piece of many, yes.
One piece of the jigsaw. It was I suppose a physical drama rather than a life drama
Yes.
that went on later in life.
Yeah. But you must have seen the answer to your prayers.
Yes.
And it must have given you that connection with
Oh
God,
yes,
I
and
believe.
since then, and since becoming a Christian and being born again, I've seen many answers to prayer, not necessarily in my own life, but in other people's lives.
Yes.
I've seen amazing things happen, which just go to reinforce the belief and reinforce that Jesus is there and he does help when you need him.
Yes.
And we have seen many miracles, I would say. Yes. I've seen, in some examples we've seen healing. In some examples we've seen families come together. In some examples we've seen people being able to find accommodation which they never would. I've been into several prisons as well since.
Have you? Yes.
Yes. And had experiences in those prisons as well. And that's just another thing that flows through from life experience, isn't it? God equips you, I suppose.
Absolutely, yes. It never ceases to amaze me, as I've said many times on here, that whatever is in our past that's been difficult, the Lord turns it for his good and for his glory.
He's just equipping you.
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
these things he brings in front of you, he's equipping you for something he has in the future.
And you may not be in a literal storm like George and his colleagues were, but there are storms in life. So I'll ask you, George, would you like to pray for anybody who's in a storm in their life right now and doesn't know what to do?
Yes. What I'd like to say is that from my own experience, I have learned that it's very important to have God in your life, to have a faith, to have a community of like-minded people around you that can help you. And if you are going through a storm in your life at this moment in time, I think I would urge you to follow the example, and that is to find God. And God will look after you. He will guide you. He'll be there for you in all your difficult situations, but he will show you the right way through. And I just pray at this moment in time that you'll find a way of seeking God, whether that be through an Alpha course or anything else. I just pray that for you at this moment in time. God bless you.
Thank you ever so much for sharing your story with us. It's been a real blessing and wonderful to see how God has moved in your life. So all praise to Jesus.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me.